evening. We're so glad you could all join us tonight for our Mental Health Monday speaker series. Being that this is a Zoom webinar, you will only see the speaker and Mental Health Monday team on the screen tonight. Your screen will not show. I'm Jean Mills, Mental Health Monday volunteer. Mental Health Monday is a collaborative ministry between St. Joan of Arc Catholic Church and Bethlehem Lutheran Church, Twin Cities. It's designed to provide support through resources, education, and social interaction for people living with mental illness, their families, friends, and people working in the mental health field. The 2020-2021 theme is Hope for the Journey. We like to begin our Mental Health Mondays with a short devotion or some inspirational thing. And I found this in a book called I Hope You Dance by Mark D. Sanders and Tia Sillers. It's called What is Hope? What is hope? To want, to desire, to expect that what's envisioned may indeed happen? Yes, to all of the above. Is hope that gut feeling that it's worth holding out and hanging on for just a little longer? Absolutely. Is hope the core of the human condition? Certainly. Can you have hope without faith and humility and wonder? That's tough. Just the thought that there's something bigger, something truer, something totally surprising out there waiting for us is priceless. What would you be without hope growing deep in your bones, thriving in every inch of you? Nothing. What does it take to hope? Everything.
Good evening. I'm Diane Warbeck, the Director of Congregational Care at Bethlehem Lutheran Church. And we are really thrilled to have Ted with us tonight. I feel like Ted is a friend, as he's been at Bethlehem several times and I've heard him speak. But I also feel you'll think that you've had a friend come into your home tonight, listening to Ted. Ted is an educator, an author, and a consultant who specializes in change and transition. It's whether it occurs in families or organizations or the community. And his emphasis is always on aiding people in utilizing their own strengths and the resources of others in facing change and transition. He has taught family education courses at the University of Minnesota. He was an adjunct faculty member at the University of St. Thomas, where he taught a graduate social work program on grief and loss. He's been a guest faculty member for the School of New Learning in DePaul University in Chicago. And he's also served as an adjunct instructor at United Theological Seminary in St. Paul. Ted was a senior trainer for the Wilder Foundation from 1985 to 1996. And that's a large endowed human service agency located in St. Paul, Minnesota. He has assumed the position after directing educational programs at Family Services Agency in Charlotte, North Carolina, and Minneapolis, Minnesota. He was an adjunct faculty member of the National Center for Family Literacy in Louisville, Kentucky. And in addition to all that, he is an accomplished author, having published over 100 articles, chapters, booklets, and poems. He is also the author or co-author of resources published by Family Services of America, Allina Hospitals, and the 3M Company. His two booklets, which maybe many of you have read or had, Loss of Dreams, A Special Kind of Grief, and Finding Hope When Dreams Have Shattered, are both used widely in grief and bereavement classes and programs. In addition to all this, I don't know how he finds time for all this. He has served on many boards, local and national. He was a national advisory member of Practical Parenting Partnership, He was a member of the board of directors for the National Association for Poetry Therapy, and locally he is board member of the Minnesota Coalition for Deaf Education and Support, and that was from 2006 to 2012. And he's been a member of the Minnesota Uruguay Partners of America. And he served a 6-year term on the Committee on Ministry for Minnesota Conferences of the United Church of Christ, and has been on the board for the Block Nurse Program in his neighborhood and community. So he is a frequent trainer, a consultant, and a speaker with many groups throughout Minnesota, across the United States, and also in other countries. In addition to regular trips to England and Scotland, where he has worked since 1989, Ted has spoken or led workshops in Uruguay, Taiwan, Russia, Moldova, Ireland, Lithuania, and Canada. And he has received awards. He received the Minnesota Council on Family Relations Distinguished Service to Families Award, the Friend of the Network Award from the Minnesota Vocational Consumer and Family Education Network, and the St. Paul Civitan Club Clergy Award in 1994. He was a Minnesota delegate to the 1980 White House Conference on Families in 2008, and he received the Outstanding Achievement Award from the National Association for Poetry Therapy. Ted is a widow and the father and stepfather of 4 children, a grandfather of 5 grandchildren, and 4 alive and 1 dead, but alive in his memory and love. With all that, I kind of wonder how he sleeps. Ted, welcome.
Good evening, everyone. After that introduction, raised the bar. I'm a bit intimidated even by hearing my own biography, but it's wonderful to be here with you this evening, and want to support the ministries of these 2 wonderful churches and parishes here in the Twin Cities area. We're meeting at a busy time in our lives and a busy intersection. Here in Minnesota, the weather is changing and a mark that we're moving into probably the true winter season. And for many, especially with COVID-19, with some of the racial unrest, the election just passed, it makes for, in some ways, a different winter than some in the past. And so it's a good time for us to be gathering. And I want this to be a time in which we can share some of our stories and look at some ways in which we cope well when faced with dire circumstances, when faced with a long winter, when faced with COVID-19, and dealing also with our own mental health issues, and to see how we can do that as well as possible, to live as fully as we can for as long as we can, no matter what we're living with, whether it's a medical condition or a mental health condition. And so I look forward to this time with you. As was said, I'm going to move through some slides that seems to help us, given this Zoom apparatus, to see the material because we can't see each other. If you have clarifying questions as I move through the slides, put them in the chat, and I will be interrupted and I'll address the clarifying questions. But I'm going to leave ample time in about 45 minutes or so for us to have some discussion together about the material that I've shared and what you know about living with loneliness, living with your own mental health challenges, so that we can learn from each other. We all do better when we all do better, Paul Wellstone said. And so if we can share some of our wisdom this evening, I think we will all do better, rather than just listening to me talk about some things that I've learned over the years as a grief and family educator. So let me move to share the screen. So here's our topic of the evening. And if you can just follow along and listen, and let's have a conversation a bit later. So paths to well-being. And there's my email if there's any questions that you have that you don't get to this evening. Sometimes our best questions happen after a session is over. Shoot me an email. And Diane and others have access to my email, and I'll be glad to send them to you. And you'll hear more about that as we go along. So here's our agenda, our plan for the evening. I'm going to start by emphasizing self-awareness. What do you know about yourself? What do you know about your own coping abilities? What do you know of the triggers that may set you off in terms of your own mental health? What do you know about things that heighten or exacerbate loneliness for you? So all of those issues. We'll talk about losses because those can in some ways inform and be part of our being alone or being together. And we'll talk about losses, including shattered dreams when life doesn't turn out the way that we thought it might. And then some distinctions between what we might call crisis grief, a time when we're going through a rough patch, as well as what we might call chronic or ongoing grief. Many people with mental health issues, as well as medical conditions, are doing it over the long term. And so they may be fairly stable, but it's ongoing. And so we'll talk about some of that and some of the distinctions between when things are acute, and then put all of that in the context of COVID-19 and the pandemic. And then I'll try to make some distinctions, and I want you to help me, distinctions between isolation and being alone and loneliness. And what do all of those mean, and how do we address each and all of those? And then lots of time in the second half hour around resiliency promotion and reasonable hope, and time for reflections about the session. What I want to suggest is that John Bratner years ago said that life itself begins with the first ending, the first separation. When a mom pushes a babe from the womb, that's the first ending, the first separation. And he said we seemingly go through endless acts of change and disruption in our lives from there on. And he said, you'd think we'd be better at this. And yet it's still a challenge for us when change happens, and especially disruptive changes that throw us off our game. And so that's our agenda this evening, to think about, can we link with others, find some connections, or do we experience more aloneness or loneliness at times like that? So I start with something from the 13th century. This is this wonderful poem by Middle Eastern poet Rumi. And he uses the metaphor of this being human is like a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival. And then I love it that he has this arc of things that can happen in any day of our lives: a joy, a depression, a meanness. So momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. In other words, he's saying that things happen that may cause us to have our own well-being challenged. Things occur in our lives and throw us off our game. And then the countercultural line in the 13th century, surprisingly, and now still in the 21st century, is the next line of the poem. Welcome and entertain them all. Welcome and entertain them all. So whatever shows up at our door, not welcome in the sense of good news, not spin or rose-colored glasses, rather, if it's even something quite tragic, how do I embrace this? How do I face this? How do I cope with this? How do I live with this? That's what Rumi was talking about in the 13th century. How do I begin to not push it away, not move into denial, not have some kind of hope that it would not have happened? It did happen. Get a second opinion. Find out if it's not, it wasn't a nightmare last night. It has some validity. If it is for real, then how do I welcome and entertain them all? And that's what we're going to be talking about this evening. How do you embrace whatever is happening in your life so that you might be able to face it and cope with it? So I've already hinted at what begins to move us in those directions is change. And change is a time when predictability breaks down. Our predictable ways of thinking and doing things are interrupted by change, and it results in uncertainty and ambiguity. Let me even, the obvious question for me to ask you is to think about even a year ago today. So November of 2019. Think about what you were doing then. Think about the state of your life at that time as you moved into that winter season, into December, into the change into 2020, and then January and February. And for many of us, we mark a major change in terms of the pandemic with March 13th, Friday the 13th, when many of our businesses and schools began to be closed here in Minnesota. And so change happened, and the life that we had even a year ago is a different life today. I had to make a decision this afternoon. I needed a few groceries, and there's a little grocery store near me. And so I walk there. But each time I walk, I'm wearing my mask. I look and see how many cars are around. I look into the grocery store before I go in to see how crowded it is, because I don't want to be part of a crowd because of the pandemic and the spike that's gone up here in Minnesota in recent days. And I went in, moved through the aisles, got my groceries, and then came home. If it had been too busy, if it had been too many people, I could have called the grocery store, ordered them online, and then gone back and picked up the bag at the front door. That's so much a change. I would not have imagined doing that in November 2019. So think for a moment about changes in your life over the last year, and especially as the pandemic has come, and as we look ahead to some of the decisions that we'll make for the next weeks and months. And how comfortable are you with uncertainty? How comfortable are you with ambiguity? Do you desire certainty? And how are you dealing with it if it's not so clear as you would desire? So here's an image I want to give you in terms of helping us understand why this particular year might be more difficult and challenging for us than lots of other years. It's what I call a four-legged stool. And so at the top are the typical losses. I don't know your particular diagnosis. Are you living with a brain tumor? Are you living with depression, with bipolar condition, schizophrenia? What is your mental health issue? Whatever it might be. Maybe it doesn't have an official diagnosis, but you're dealing with the stress of the pandemic. Or maybe you've been going through a divorce, or maybe there's been a death in your family. And so at the top are what I call typical losses that lots of us experience at one time or another and multiple times in our lives. They're common, and we have various kinds of traditions of rehabilitation, of rites of passage, of funerals, of various ways in which we address whatever the condition might be. So there's one leg of the stool, and I'm guessing that's the reason that this mental health ministry has been going on for a number of years, to help you to live and cope with what we might call typical things in terms of mental health that many people experience. For some, even those can create what I call a shattered dream, that life doesn't turn out the way that we thought it would. The pictures that we had inside of this time in our life doesn't match the way it is. And so shattered dreams are personal, has to do with our own identity, with our sense of meaning, our sense of the world that we're a part of. And I've written and spoken a lot about when shattered dreams occur in our lives. And so it's a difficult thing for us. And then here's two that have been added, especially in recent years. And the third one, the state of the world, goes back even before COVID-19. In early 2019, I could have been leading a caregiver group, for example, or a cancer support group, or a depression group, or a job loss group, or a bereavement group. That's the kind of work that I do. I move about meeting with volunteers and professionals around disruptive changes. And what began to strike me in early 2019 was that often at the end of the session, people had worked hard on whatever was their typical loss, their personal loss. And toward the end of the session, they would turn to me or to other members of the group and say, you know, if I wake in the middle of the night, I'm really not thinking about my cancer. If I perseverate in the middle of the day, I'm not thinking about my dead husband. And on they would say, you know, whatever was their particular kind of presenting issue, I'm worried about the state of the world. And I heard that repeatedly, not from the same person, but different groups, different situations, and began to ask people what it meant for them. And some it was quite specific. For some it was fear that the planet will not be around in 100 years for their grandchildren because of the ecology and the failing climate and the climate change that's going on. For others, it had to do with the haves and have-nots, had to do with racial unrest, had to do with leadership of our countries, had to do with immigration issues. So people had their own worries about the state of the world and what was going to be happening next. And so it created a kind of sadness and worry and a collective loss because it was shared. Often when people said, I'm worried about the state of the world. Someone else in the group would say, me too, over here. And so there, I'm wondering where you are with your sense of the state of the world. Are you feeling a bit of relief after the election? Are you worried about what might happen over the three months until there's a new president? We all have our different opinions about that. So that's a third leg of the stool. The one that we're talking about more this evening than the state of the world, though I wanted to acknowledge the state of the world, is COVID-19. And when that began, as I said, back in March or so, the first reaction was not one of loss, but of confusion, ambiguity, anxiety about an unclear future. Pablo Neruda said, we would be in this together in a sudden strangeness. We will be in this together in what he called a sudden strangeness. And it is a sudden strangeness. As I said, even going to the grocery store takes some planning, wondering how one can do that. So again, I'm asking you in terms of self-awareness to think about your own mental health. Think about shattered dreams. Think about any concerns you have about the state of the world for yourself or for someone else. And think about what are your reactions to the pandemic. And it's that I want us to consider as we move forward. So let's just do some definitions and look at some distinctions here. Let me go back here. Sorry about that. So, I have to hold it evidently. Loss refers to being deprived of or ceasing to have something that one formerly possessed or to which one was attached. Loss refers to being deprived of or ceasing to have something that one formerly possessed or to which one was attached. What if you or your child is not now in a public or private school, but is doing virtual learning, and you loved being a part of the school environment? What if you, as an employee, enjoyed going to work, being with your mates, doing the work that you loved in some ways, but now you're either underemployed or working from home? What if you had your health, your well-being, and now you don't have that same health and well-being? Loss refers to being deprived of or ceasing to have something that one formerly possessed or to which one was attached. We also experience fears about the future, about one's competence or one's well-being, and our ability to hold on and address the things that we're dealing with. Are you at a place of some fear, some scare about your own future and your own competence to deal with your situation? And then, as I said earlier, there may be the issue of the anxiety occurs when faced with ambiguity and lack of clarity and unsure future. And so wrapped around that are, I'm speaking about it especially in terms of fears of loss of control, fears of loss of self-image, fears of dependency, fears of stigma, fears of abandonment, fears of expressing anger, isolation, even the fear of death. All of those get overlapped with losses and with anxiety about our futures. So things that affect our experience of loss are not only the losses themselves and some of the fears and the anxiety, but the nature of the attachment that we had to what we've lost. The nature of the attachment that we had to what we've lost. I'm in an aging body, and so I'm not able to do some things that I did in an earlier period, and I was attached to some of those. I will never run a marathon again. I did 2 earlier in my life. And so I have to adjust my attachment to that. And so, yes, I will run a 5K, perhaps even a 10K, but I want to get out and do some running and keep that going. What if I'd had a leg injury? And the nature of my attachment to that. What are the personality of variables that you have, including tolerance for change? Are you a person who needs clarity, needs an agenda, needs a plan? Are you a bit more loosey-goosey? Can you go with the flow? What about power and control? Who's in charge now? Are there other losses that whatever you're dealing with at the moment, you're reminded of because of this current loss? I know enough from bereavement care that whatever is the current death that someone is grieving, it often reminds them of earlier losses. 3 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago. They all began to get glommed together in some ways. What else is going on in your circle of care, the social and family variables, the past, present, and future? Things are not happening to you at the same time that they are to others. I had a grandson who headed off to college in August, the college of his dreams, and here he was, that first year of college. It's such an eye-opener and a big thing for so many people. And after 5 weeks in college, he was sent home because there were too many cases of COVID-19 on the campus and in the county in which the college was located. So a bit of a shattered dream and a life change event for this young man in my life and his shattered dream. So here's a piece that I want us to talk about more at length later. You may want to even put into something in the chat if you have some questions about this. First, I want to, in terms of addressing the theme of loneliness this evening, I want to assert some of the wisdom of Bob Vaninga in the School of Public Health at the University of Minnesota. He wrote years ago that almost without exception, those who survived tragedies give credit to one person in their life who stood by them, supported them, and gave them a sense of hope. So part of what I want to ask even at the front end of this session is, who is there for you? Are you attending this support group this evening because you find support here once a month or at the sessions that they offer on some regular basis? Who is there for you? Who can you lean on? Who can you offload with? It's not the more people that we have, but do we have a few people in our lives that will allow us to do some of those things? And then I want us to struggle this evening with some distinctions between isolation. And isolation is the process of limited contact, sometimes limited by others, and that's happening in our state and across the world because of the quarantine. That we're supposed to be wearing masks, we're not able to be in public groups. And so American Thanksgiving, Christmas, Hanukkah, solstice, we're going to have to find out ways to do those more creatively because we will be isolated physically from one another. We're in some ways doing that this evening, but we don't have to be isolated. We can still be together, but virtually. I would suggest to you that being alone is not the same as feeling alone. There are lots of people who are introverts who are having less a hard time with the pandemic than extroverts because they like, in some ways, being alone and like themselves as their best friend. And so I want you to, where do you fall on that continuum? Most of us are not at one end or the other, but can you enjoy being alone so that you then are not feeling lonely even though you might be alone, but you enjoy being with yourself and doing your thing, whatever that might be. And so loneliness can either be self-imposed because we pull back because of being embarrassed, because of being intimidated, because of being scared. We can pull back from others, or it can result from stigma or isolation where we're not included. And part of what I want to suggest as we go on this evening, and again, I want this for discussion, this is not the truth, this is simply my way of thinking about this, is that the antidote to isolation is connection and community. Assertiveness may be required to address imposed isolation or loneliness. And so we'll talk a bit more as we go on about how we can reach out to even ask for help. Let me even give you one example right now. I walked out of a care facility one evening with a woman whose husband was dying of a brain tumor. So she was dealing with all kinds of grief and the impending death of her husband. I'd sat with her to break the isolation so that she wasn't the only one. I'd done it before. I was willing to do it again. But as I walked out of the care facility with her that evening, I turned to her and I said, I've done this. I'm willing to do it again. Is there any other way I can be helpful to you? And she looked at me without hesitation and said, would you mind cleaning up my house? Well, I hadn't expected that. No one's ever asked me to do that. And so I asked her directly. I said, no one has ever asked me to do that. Can you tell me where that request came for? I'm willing to consider it, but tell me more. And she said, Ted, it's so hard to be here in this place of death and dying every day and then go home to a dirty house. I just don't have the energy to clean it anymore. So she was being assertive so that she could go home, be alone, knowing her husband would not be there, but she was being assertive so that she would have an inviting place to go home to. That's what I mean by assertiveness, and doing it in a way that might allow you to be alone. Because what we know is unless we are willing to be assertive, that suffering can be the smallest room. The sufferer's suffering, it can be the smallest room, and there the sufferer can live unless they're willing to reach out to create that community that I spoke of earlier. So that's a key piece. I want us to come back to it again and again this evening. So let's talk about another piece that can exacerbate being alone or loneliness. It's what we would call ambiguous loss, and I've referred to it several times, but here are some definitions. It's losses that are unclear, confusing, and for which future stories and outcomes are unknown. We're driven in two ways. It's not just a bipolar condition, manic depressive illness, in which we're driven in two ways, but it's any of the losses that we have a bit of lack of clarity. I'm guessing some of you know the story of Kay Redfield Jamison, who lives with manic depressive illness, and she, in a wonderful piece called Missing Saturn, she says, some of my reluctance, no doubt, stemmed from a fundamental denial that what I had was a real disease. This is a common reaction that follows rather counterintuitively in the wake of earlier episodes of manic depressive illness. Moods are such an essential part of the substance of life, of one's notion of oneself, that even the flights of mood can be seen as temporary, even understandable. And so she's talking about the confusion that she had in living this. My family and friends expected that I would welcome being normal, being appreciative of lithium, and taking it in stride, having normal energy and sleep. But if you've had stars in your feet and the rings of planets through your hands, are used to sleeping only 4 or 5 hours a night, and now sleep 8, are used to staying up all night for days and weeks in a row, and now cannot. It is a real adjustment to blend into a 3-piece suit schedule, which, while comfortable to many, is restrictive, seemingly less productive, and madly less intoxicating. And so she's talking about being driven in both ways and not knowing which way she would wake up the next day. And so if we're experiencing loss, and I wonder, as you look to the left, what do you see there? I wish I could do a hand count. And how many of you saw a rabbit first? And how many of you saw a duck first? What I'm getting at is ambiguity again. We can be looking at the same image, but we may see something quite different. And so Pauline Boss, again, has talked about this confusion of ambiguous losses, of what she calls psychological presence and physical absence. And so that's, for example, part of what I'm experiencing at the moment. My wife of 41 years died suddenly, unexpectedly, July 29th. And so she is physically absent, but she's still psychologically present in my life. Very much present. I feel the ghost, I feel the presence. Her clothes are still around. We fixed up our place 2 years ago to move into an apartment together. And here we are 41 years after being in another house. And her psychological presence is still very much there, but physically absent. Women who've lost a breast to cancer, it's a psychological presence, but a physical absence. They will tell me even 10 years afterwards, when they're dressing a certain morning, they will miss the breast that was there. It's the phantom limb. It may be the house that you lived in before. You have a psychological presence, but a physical absence. We certainly are having some of that with our get-togethers at pubs and restaurants and going out to concerts and things, a psychological presence, but a physical absence. And then physical presence and psychological absence. That was my mom as she moved further and further into the fog of Alzheimer's. She still had a wonderful smile. She still had a wonderful personality up until close to the end, but she was psychologically absent. We lost our mother before we lost our mother. What we know about lots of grieving people is that they can be physically present, but psychologically absent because they're preoccupied with their own losses, with their own grieving. And yes, we know that about some of the mental health conditions, that people can be physically present, but they're absorbed in some ways as they should be with their own psychological well-being and how they are performing and how they are feeling that particular day. And so it can be physically present, but psychologically absent. I share this in part because it relates both to grief and loss, but it can contribute to what we would call loneliness or being alone, or why people might misunderstand us because they don't understand our condition, that we can be physically present and psychologically absent, or psychologically present and physically absent. So here it is related, bringing it back home to the pandemic. And Pauline Boss again, she says, what is distressing us is not just the virus, but the ambiguity surrounding it, what it will do and what we should do about it. And so we're experiencing the uncertainty, and that's very stressful for a people or a society that is accustomed to solving problems and having definitive answers. And so while she's speaking explicitly about the pandemic, it's also something related to the conditions that we live with. If you like clarity and you can't get that, then you want to solve it. You want it fixed. You want someone to rescue you. And yet it's embracing the ambiguity. And we can talk more about that. How do we embrace ambiguity? Going back to the Rumi poem, how do we welcome and entertain that? Well, part of what I had to do with my mom was to begin to experience and love whatever mom showed up, because I didn't know, especially toward the end, which mom would be there on a given day. Would she be in a coma? Or would she be a bit sharp that day and have some memories that she could share with me? I never knew which mom would show up because of her dementia. And so let's talk a little bit about shattered dreams. I mentioned that before, but it has to do with when these pictures of our lives, emotionally important images of oneself or one's family, one's life, one's work, even one's death, gets altered. We lose the possibilities of what might have been. Here's an example of it from Jane Kenyon. I got out of bed on 2 strong legs. It might have been otherwise. Ate cereal, sweet milk, ripe flawless peach. It might have been otherwise. I took the dog uphill to the birch wood. On morning, I did the work I love, and she goes on through a typical day. I slept in a bed in Rome with paintings on the wall and planned another day just like this day. But one day I know it will be otherwise. I'm guessing some of you could give me the hour, the day, the month, and the year that was an otherwise day for you, when things in your life began to be turning upside down, when you fell off the wagon and became more moving toward more addiction and more use of various chemicals. Can be the death of someone, can be the change of job, can be whatever it is that's a shattered dream for you, and it becomes an otherwise day for us. So what I'm doing, and we're going to shift in just a bit to respond to this, is naming a number of losses, disruptive changes in our life that may affect your mental health condition. And so grief is a whole body response to loss. It is emotional. It's the sadness, the anger, the tears, the rage, but it's also cognitive. What does stage 4 cancer mean? When they say Lewy body dementia, what do they mean? Do we have enough insurance? Can I pay for this? Is this something that can be cured? It's a spiritual response to loss. What kind of world? What kind of God? Does this make sense? Is it fair? And then it's a visceral response to loss, a physical response to loss. Why am I so tired? And so those of you who are living with a demanding mental health condition, it may in some days just be the visceral, because your body is both grieving as well as dealing with any of the medications that you're taking and the impact that they have on your body. And that may affect your emotional functioning, your cognitive functioning, as well as your spiritual functioning. And what makes this all the more challenging in community is that one size doesn't fit all, and each person copes differently and grieves differently. So let's begin to move toward how do we face these things. I've been hinting at it so far, but let's make it a bit more overt. That throughout our lives, we are challenged to story and restory. I mentioned it with John Bratner earlier, that the first phase of life is separation from the mother, and then growing up and that child, as a child in the family. And so it involves grieving the old story before creating the next, not necessarily new story. Let's even go back to childhood again. Judith Viorst has a story about a little boy. My mom says I'm her sugar plum. My mom says I'm her lamb. My mom says I'm completely perfect just the way I am. My mom says I'm a wonderful, special, terrific little guy. My mom just had another baby. Why? See, the story had changed. If you're the firstborn, the king or the queen, everybody's doting on you because of being the firstborn, male or female. And then something begins to show up in mother's belly or arise with some strange word called adoption or foster care. It's not unheard of that a child will want to get rid of that. In fact, we had a child come to knock on our door a few years ago, a boy from down the street, about 6 years of age. And I opened the door and said hello to him. And he said hello to me. And he said, would you like a baby? And I thought he must have been talking about a gerbil or a hamster or a cat or a dog. But he said, my mom's pregnant and we don't need another one. He was beginning to grieve the story that he would have to share space, have to share time. And so we have to grieve that old story, even grieve the shattered dream in order to create the new story. And so we take some major components, themes, and values of the old story to see how they can be reframed in the new story. And so we tell that boy that you will always be our firstborn, and there's no other child ever going to be exactly like you. And you have some characteristics, you have some abilities that we wouldn't trade for the world. Yes, you may have a sister or brother, but they will be different. And so we began to let that child know that his or her abilities are not going to be thwarted because of having a sibling to come and live in the same household. Here's a way in which a fellow changed a story. It's an amazing, amazing piece. It's a bit busy. Let me read it to you. And while it's a story of another form of dementia, I want you to use it as a metaphor for how are you learning to live with yourself, with whatever you are living with. And so this is Floyd's flute story. I'm not getting any better, but I'm also not getting any worse. At 54, after 13 years of living with static dementia, I've discovered just where that leaves me. Static dementia, he had a virus in his brain. It did the damage, but with the antibiotics and other medical interventions, the virus was killed and gone, but the damage had already been done. And so different than Lewy body dementia or Alzheimer's, his is called static dementia. And so he said, since I've discovered just where that leaves me, since I cannot presume I will remember anything, I must live fully in the present. Since I cannot presume that I will understand anything, I must feel and experience my life in the moment and not always press to formulate ideas about it. Since I cannot escape my body and the limits it has imposed on me, I must learn to be at home in it. Since I can do so little, it is good to live in a place where there is little to do. He moved from the countryside, or from the city to the countryside, because he needed to be in a place with fewer distractions. And then the final line of his assertiveness is, since I cannot presume that I will master anything I do, I must relinquish mastery as the goal and seek harmony instead. What a story. It's an amazing ability of coping with something that has left its mark. In his case, it's a fixed mark, static dementia, but it's a way in which he begins to learn how to live with it. Here's, let me go back again. I keep scrolling over these. Let's go to this image here. I think this will help us because I've been giving you lots of words. Look at the jars, if you will, with me. Look at the first row of jars. Often at the point of diagnosis or onset, an assessment or an exacerbation, the stone in the jar, the first jar there, it's the dominant narrative. It's all we can think about. We get preoccupied with it and so on. But then we do begin to learn to cope with it. And you see the second and the third jar, there's still a stone in the jar. You're still living with something, but it's not now the dominant narrative. It might even have been something that you've learned to live with. A father was feeding his young child by a feeding tube, and a man friend was there one day, and he said, "How the heck do you do that?" And the father said, "If I thought about it too much, I probably wouldn't be able to do it. I wouldn't be able to feed my child." And so it was simply his way of feeding his child. This wasn't a major kind of mystery and so on. And so I'm wondering even about your own mental health. maybe that's not the preoccupying thing for you now. You've learned to live with it. You do your medications, you do your support groups, you do your therapy, whatever it requires, and you've learned to live with it. And it's part of your life, but not the major thing, the dominant narrative. Well, another way of saying that, look at the bottom row. And so you see there are 3 stones, and let's call that the first year or the first month, the 3rd month or the 3rd year or the 10th year. And you have the stone just as big all along. That's what I described earlier as a chronic sorrow, an ongoing kind of experience that you're living with, that it may not change a great deal. And so it's there and it's ongoing. But note what happened to the jars. It's the ability to grow life around even a chronic sorrow, something that's quite big for you, and learn how to live with it. Let me share my own story, because I've shared a bit about my mom, but my wife died in July of this year. And it's been very hard living without her. We had 41 wonderful years together, just celebrated our 41st anniversary, and then she died suddenly and unexpectedly of a cardiac arrest. About 2 months after she died, I realized that I wanted to be sure I was trying to grow my life, even in that I knew that I was still grieving enormously and would be for weeks and months. And here's a poem I wrote. I will color this time. I will color this time with more than a black armband, a past marker of death. Some of you young ones might not know that at an earlier time in our history, when there was a death in a family, the other family members often put on a black armband for 3 months or 6 months or even for a year as a sign that they were still grieving their father's death, their mother's death, someone else's death. And so I started with that. I will color this time with more than a black armband, a past marker of death. I will reach for brilliant, bold, bright colors and subdued beiges, blues, and blush. I yearn for an array of color, similar to the rainbow of flowers sent so soon after her death, reminding me of the colorful life that we shared and that I can still have. Do you hear the both and, the ambiguity? I'm grieving, but I'm also yearning to continue to have some color in my life, that this doesn't have to be just a dark period. I don't have to be lonely. I can have friends and colleagues and family who are part of my life and continue to help me to grow my world. So I'm talking about the difference between a chronic sorrow and what we might call a complicated grief or a complicated mental illness. Both contain sorrow. They can be ongoing, contain elements of depressive emotions and experiences. The key difference is, my friend, is the ability to grow life, experience joy and fullness regularly while also grieving or dealing with a mental illness. Here's some wisdom from Nell Noddings. I hope that we can have discussions about several of these points. Joy as a seemingly real quality of our world can invade us even in pain and periods of deep grief. It does not seem to be the case that joy and grief can occur simultaneously, but they can occur alternately. That is, the pervasive emotion may be grief or being overwhelmed or distressed, you name it, and yet joy can slip in momentarily. So it may happen that even in the deepest periods of despair and guilt and sorrow, regret, despair, grief, I may still see and feel joy there in the world trembling at my fingertips. Turning from the graveside or leaving the hospital after holding a dying hand, joy may burst through like a rainbow over tears. Grief is thereby not lessened. Indeed, it can be intensified, but made all the more palpable. That's what we're going to call honest hope, that we can even hope in hard times. And so I hope you see that I'm moving toward helping us look to how we respond to some of these kinds of things. So here's a scheme in terms of responding to loss. I've been saying now for over a half hour that it's important that we name losses. If something's unmentionable, it's also unmanageable. It's important that we grieve our losses. Put the losses in perspective. How big is this? How important is this? Is this something that is negotiable for me or non-negotiable? Reinforce and rebuild our support connections. saying no to some things so that we can say some yes to others. And then to begin to develop a healing plan. And I especially want to stop and highlight that one because I want us to talk about this. What is part of your healing plan? What helps you to lift your spirits? What helps you to live with whatever you're living with? I start off each day with a hot black cup of coffee and a cereal dish with yogurt and some fresh fruit. And I start my day with that kind of healing plan. I've been doing it for years. But a healing plan also for me includes Mother Nature. And some people, given what we're saying about the pandemic, is that it's not how cold it's going to be in Minnesota this year, it's how good our clothes are. Are we willing to put on more clothes so that we can get outside and be outside with one another and enjoy Mother Nature even when it's quite chilly and cold and freezing? Is it music? Is it talking with others, even virtually, and sending messages back and forth? Is it your faith? Is it massage? What is it that's a healing plan for you? And we may need to use rituals for grieving and healing, rites of passage where we celebrate and acknowledge some of our changes. So just a couple more slides and then let's have a conversation together. Some examples of resiliency. There's the serenity prayer. Accept what we can change and what we cannot. I hope you know that and know the difference. A big one is the second one. Manageable pieces and steps. Lots of people get overwhelmed and can begin to pull back, be embarrassed, begin to isolate themselves from others because they're dealing with the forest and the trees, instead of finding help to do it in manageable pieces, to break it into manageable pieces and steps. That's what my friend did when I walked out with her that evening. Ted, would you mind cleaning up my house? That was one thing that she didn't have to do. If there are things that you need to help yourself in terms of a healing plan, create a menu. And so if someone says, how can I be helpful? Wow, you're going through a hard patch. Is there anything I can do? I would urge you then to turn to them and say, do you really mean that? Here's a list. Look at the list and see which of these you might be willing to do sometime this week or next. It could be to fetch something for you from a store. It could be to read a book with you. It could be to play some songs, even virtually or by Zoom, or whatever it is, and so on. Use creativity. That's what I'm talking about. Heal yourself by helping others. That's what we're going to do in just a moment with each other. Enough of this with TED Talk. Let's hear each other and heal one another by helping one another with our wisdom and with our questions. Do not allow bitterness to consume or define you. That's not to say don't be angry, don't have an edge, but don't let that become your defining narrative. And then to begin to build on hopeful visions of the future, as well as your spiritual resources. What wonderful churches these two are that have this mental health ministry. And so just a couple more things. This is what we call a dual process model, and I hope you've been hearing that. I haven't been using the words, but think of some arrows going back and forth between these two circles. It's the ability for us to move in different directions. And so I talked earlier about a loss orientation, the grief, the mental illness, the mental health, the intrusion, facing changes, your own self-care. I'm sure you know a lot about those kinds of things. But note the other side is restoration orientation, attending to life changes, doing new things, distraction, respite, just getting away from things, new roles, new identities, things that can be beneficial to you. And our health comes when we have the ability to move back and forth between these two circles. Some people live with a kind of depressiveness that can be insidious, and it's very hard to live with unless they can begin to move to the other side with some restoration and begin to find some way to not be just focused on what's missing and what's wrong. Here's again Kay Redfield Jamison in terms of some of the differences between grief and depression. There were 1,000 things I remembered once David had died. This is her husband. And there were many, many regrets for lost opportunities, unnecessary and damaging arguments, a deepening realization that there was nothing that could be done to change what was true. There were so many dreams lost. We lost our plans for a house full of children and other things that were lost. But grief, fortunately, is very different than depression. It is sad. It can be awful, but it is not without hope. David's death did not plunge me into undurable darkness. Suicide never crossed my mind, and there was a very real solace in the offsetting and enormous kindness of friends and strangers to help her with her own grieving. And so she had the ability to move to the restoration side. And so hope has to do with expectation and desire, which then leads us with some of the sub-themes of goals and attributes and redefinition and meaning and peace and energy. What is it that promotes your own energy, your own sense of serenity, causes some redefinition, helps you to move forward with what we would call reasonable hope? And so here are 5 bullets and then just one poem before we move some discussion. So I'm alerting the other panelists to be ready, checking the chat. And if you have a question or a comment to begin, to put it in the chat. What I've been trying to say tonight is that reasonable hope is relational. Bob Vaninga again, those who get through a tragedy point to at least one person who stood by them, supported them, and gave them a sense of hope. Reasonable hope is a practice. We don't leave this just to good intentions or hope that we get up on the right side of the bed. We have to work at it. Look at number 4. We have to set goals and pathways to them, put them on the calendar to be sure that we don't let them pass by. I know a woman who knew that her own mental health was conditional on being able to swim for at least 2 hours once a week. And so she arranged for care for other people so that she could get into the water and move her arms and legs and began just to have the experience of moving through the water. What is it that helps you to find that kind of hope? The middle one has to do with the ambiguity. Reasonable hope maintains the future is open, uncertain, and influenceable. So there's the ambiguity, but we can influence and we can have some rocks of stability in our lives. And then the final one, that reasonable hope accommodates doubt, contradictions, and despair. That if we really have an honest, reasonable hope, it's not spin or rose-colored glasses. It can deal with doubt and contradictions and despair. So let's look at this one poem to end with, and then let's move and have some of your questions and comments and more discussion, and we'll move away from the slides. This is from Denise Levertov. I have only one small grain of hope. That's on our days when we feel a bit depleted. I have only one small grain of hope. I need more. I break off a fragment of my hope to send to you. Please take this grain of hope so that mine won't shrink. Please share your fragment so that yours will grow. Only by division will hope increase. The wisdom of Denise Levertov is that she's saying that hope is contagious. And so the more that we can be with people as we are tonight in this meeting, the more contagious it will be if we can learn from one another. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen and have my panelist friends to come back and join me so that we can hear your questions and your comments. Please raise questions, but also if you have something that you would say are examples of hope that we can draw on, share those with us.
Well, Ted, one person wants to know, for caregivers, to those who grieve, how can they project the feeling of hopefulness to those who may be going through what they may be the worst time of their lives?
It's a wonderful question. And what I would simply say is to simply be present and be in attendance. To not let the tough time the other person's going through push you away. And not that you have to fix it, not that you have to rescue, but please just sit with them on their mourning bench. Please just sit with them on their bench of going through a hard time. And at times you don't have to say anything, but just to be there with them and to know that, because the worst is abandonment. The worst is when it moves toward loneliness. And so for you to be present, even if you don't know what to say, even if you're not quite sure what to do, but to say, I just wanted to be here with you. And so that I would recommend. And then you can begin, if they see that you mean it and that you're not going away, then perhaps you can begin to talk about some steps that you can take to help them to move forward, some things they can do. An example even there, a kind of mundane example that many people know is if someone knows that they live with body pain or that they know that they live with a kind of depressive illness, and they know that it would be easier in some days just to stay in bed. What they do before they go to bed the night before is to put out a set of clothes on the chair so that they see that, and it helps them to not keep wearing their PJs all day, but to begin to dress up and get themselves ready for the next day. Or have one of those coffee makers where if you need a black cup of coffee to get you going in the morning, that it's on at 6:30 or 7 o'clock when you wake up. What's next?
So, how do you help someone who feels they cannot see God any longer? Loss of faith.
Okay. Well, they're in good company. Have them read the Psalms in the Older Testament. Many of the people were saying, "Where were you, God, when I needed you?" And so be aware that they may be experiencing a faith crisis. And so again, it's similar to what I was saying earlier. One of the things that can be so debilitating if someone's going through a rough patch is that someone begins to foist their faith on someone else. Rather, your faith should simply have you be a good neighbor and be the good Samaritan that befriends the person there on the roadway. And so rather than impose a faith or try to have them reach back to faith, to honor that they are going through a faith crisis and say, at times we just need to wail at God. Let's hear your prayer. Let's hear your wail. Let me wail with you. And there we can begin to be with them rather than to be separate from them. And there are wonderful pieces of poetry and song and lyrics that might be helpful in terms of their ability to have that kind of cry, that kind of lament. Next.
Okay, hold on one second.
Okay.
Okay, this one's kind of long, so be patient with me. I have not dated many people. My first real boyfriend was not until I was 19, and it was very tumultuous and difficult relationship for 10 years. Then I met a man who I fell deeply in love with, and we had 2 years together. He then ended the relationship because he started a business and wanted to devote all his time to this. He loved me, but felt he couldn't be a full partner to me. We broke up almost 7 years ago, and I have not had a relationship since. I still feel this energy around me, even though I now live 6 states away from him. I have a counselor, and I work to build new dreams for myself. How can I be able to have another relationship again without being terrified of being left and hurt again?
Yes. I think of a couple of things. There is, I think it's a Chinese proverb. It may be in lots of different cultures. The Chinese proverb that says that everyone is like a piece of paper and each passerby leaves a mark. All of us are like a piece of paper and each passerby leaves a mark. And what you're describing is this 2-year relationship and longer has left a mark on you. And it sounds like it was a loving relationship for the time that you had, and that you treasure that. And so I hope that you can take even that part to the bank with you, to know that you were lovable and that you could love someone else. And evidently the man is not ready to continue the relationship. He's made another decision. That's not a statement about you. That's a statement about him. And so to know that you are lovable, and so to also know that you bring whatever experiences of lovability and relationship with you if you begin to explore another relationship. It's not being a betrayal to him and what you had back there and then. We all learn from previous relationships and take some of those learnings into current relationships. And so give yourself credit for your lovability and the 2 years that you had, and see what you might take with you from that experience to the future.
So our next one is some tips for parents working with special needs children who are grieving friends and the time with them.
Say again, I lost a little bit of that.
Some tips for parents working with special needs children who are grieving friends and time with them.
Oh, yes. Oh, gosh. Maybe there are others who can speak up and help with this one, because it's such an issue, because we know that given some of the special needs, and especially children on the autism continuum or ADHDs and so on, that they may miss the personal contacts and the virtual technology that we're using is not as accessible to some of them. And so that's where I would urge people to be creative and try to find ways in which they can meet each other safely out in the open, in Mother Nature, taking walks, doing things that are safe outside, so that a child or an adult or an elder can have some of the experiences of being with another human being that is so important to them. Each of us has our own reactions to what some people call Zoom fatigue, the technology fatigue. And for some people, and I think this questioner is speaking that for some people, it's more acute for them, that they just yearn for having a personal contact and someone to be with. It may be in some families, the parents try to create a pod, if possible, between that child and an adult that is willing to be safe with them and help them with some of their own learning, with some activities, with some music, with whatever it might be, but to find ways in which they can stretch and build some of those connections. It may be ways also that we begin to find ways to use the technology in other ways. I know some families that are doing some projects, even long distance, where they will be making bread, someone in Minnesota and someone in California making the same bread, and they are talking to one another and having that kind of conversation using the technology to create connections.
Can you give some pointers on how to cope with a job loss?
There are many people experiencing variations of that. Some, it's the true job loss. For some people, it's being underemployed or less employed, I think especially in the hospitality industry and so on. One thing I would say about that is to be aware that that's not because you did something that was wrong or you failed. It has to do with the pandemic, has to do with the economy, it has to do with, our environment at this present time. So be kind to yourself around that. And is this a time that do you do some adjusting to do something that you would prefer not to do, but know that it's temporary, to get you through, to be able to pay the bills, to do some things, to do some work that's not your preferred thing, but know that it is temporary? Or is this a time to do more preparation, get some more training or some schooling, if that's feasible and possible, so that you're ready when doors begin to open up later? We know it's not going to be immediately, so I don't want to give you rose-colored glasses here, because the pandemic's going to go on for another 6 months or more for sure. And so how do you either cope well in the meantime or prepare yourself for life after the pandemic?
Is there any other questions people want to put in the Q&A or in the chat?
Or if people have some of their own wisdom to share with one another, what would you add to what I said about loneliness, about ambiguity, about coping well, about the dual process model of being able to vacillate between times of distress and times of joy? So add some of your own wisdom or comments.
Well,
Give people a moment. How about any of the panelists? Do you have something that you want to add to move us forward?
well, I think your point about the grieving the ambiguous losses too, is very important to remember.
Yes, and it's a tough one for lots of us, and it gets, as I said, exacerbated by COVID, because even now we still have lots of ambiguity about what the future with the pandemic is going to be. The president-elect has already put together a health advisory committee to try to help us get some clarity about, at least assuming that he will be in office in January, how things might go forward with more clarity. nationally as well as here in the state. One thing I might add, Teresa, see if someone does a chat. I know that we're getting close to the ending time, but this relates to the stability and the ambiguity that you just mentioned. And it's a poem by William Stafford, and it relates to what we might call a healing plan. And it's about a thread. He said, there's a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you're pursuing. You have to explain about the thread, but it's hard for others to see. While you hold it, it can't get lost. Tragedies happen, people get hurt or die, you suffer, you get old. Nothing you can do stop time's unfolding, but you don't ever let go of the thread. What he's speaking about are, I want you to think about, what are some of your anchors? What are some of your foundational pieces that help you to embrace what comes? I mentioned some earlier, and I would be curious about what some of you use. I've mentioned Mother Nature, I've mentioned music, I've mentioned having colorful things around, getting into the outside, doing some creative things even this way by using the technology, reading books, the wisdom of others. Part of my own coping with my wife's death was just people would send things, cards and notes and song lyrics, and it's what I call random resources that helped me with my own healing. So can you use the words of others to help you with your own healing? Certainly has been a help to me.
Yeah, one person said support groups even on Zoom are so helpful, and they're grateful for several AA groups each week.
Ah, okay. Yep.
And
Diane, I think gratitude journals also help, or time at the end of the day or the beginning of the day to really talk about some things that you're grateful for. It may even be just that your pillow is comfortable at night, but something to identify that you're grateful for during the day.
Yep.
yeah,
Barbara Kingsolver has a lovely piece. She says that in her times of despair and grief and loss, her spirits are lifted by single glorious things. A red geranium outside the bedroom window, children in a playground playing in brightly colored clothes, a sunset or a sunrise, until she says, until I've learned to be in love with life again. So it's the direction in which we look will determine what we see. And so can we lift our spirits by looking in a different direction? Yeah, thank you, Diane.
another person said they have found it helpful to expand their definition of deep love. Not being in a romantic relationship has been hard, not being in a romantic relationship has been hard, but my heart is full when I spend time with my baby nephew.
Okay. Yeah, that we may have differential loves, and hold on to those loves that we have that can be quite deep with a young child like that, or with a good friend. Lots of our friends are more family-like than sometimes our family are. And so can we have some of that deep love? Yes, it's not going to be romantic. It's not going to be sexual necessarily, but it's that deep love. And can we celebrate that?
Another person put gardening and quilting, taking pride in something you are growing and creating.
Oh, yes, indeed. Yeah. Some people, I saw them last weekend because we had the warm weather too, began to plant seeds of flowers that will show up in spring. So they were doing some early gardening even for next April and May. And then the crafts that some people, they express themselves through writing, through doing quilting, doing knitting, doing painting, whatever it is, that is their way of expressing themselves.
Somebody wanted to quote a poem, and it says, I want to be famous so I can be humble about being famous. What good is my humility when I am stuck in this obscurity? David Budbill.
Okay, that's a lovely one. Could you say that one again?
Hold on a second. I want to be famous so I can be humble about being famous. What good is my humility when I'm stuck in this obscurity?
Yes. Yeah. He's a wonderful poet, and he does have a rare sense of humor. So yeah, I would commend him to many of us.
Well, is there any other questions or thoughts people want to put in the Q&A or in chat? We got a few minutes left before time to wrap up. Somebody has their hand raised, but we can't. They have to put it in chat or in the Q&A. I don't know how to get their hand raised answered.
Okay.
So David, if you could put your question or response in the chat or in the Q&A area. Hold on one second. Well, I'm just asking our technical person about this hand raising thing. We didn't have that in our previous program, so I just want to make sure that we're responding to David. Okay, she's going to let him speak. David, can you unmute yourself? There you go. David, you can say what you want to say. David?
I'm right
Okay.
here. Can you
Yeah.
hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. Go ahead and ask your
I
question.
just typed in, can you say some words about the value of a sense of humor and not taking oneself too seriously?
So important, David. Sometimes easier said than done, but yes, the more that we can laugh at ourselves and see some of our foibles, the more healthy that we can be. If that's something that is not something that you are really good at, I would urge you to try to widen your circle of friends to include some of those people, because it's a bit like the poem that Teresa just read, that if someone has a good sense of humor and can lift our spirits, it gets contagious to us and we can benefit from it. And so the more that we can not take ourselves too seriously, all the better. And then if we can add that sense of humor, that for me is something that can be very healthy. I love, for example, looking at New Yorker cartoons or even the funny pages of the newspaper and just sitting there enjoying that at times instead of looking at the news on the front page.
We have one comment and then we'll switch to wrapping up. They want to say thank you so much for the presentation. They feel like the process of acknowledging grief and loss is a wonderful part of the healing journey.
Well, thank you for that. It's wonderful to be with you this evening. And I just want to commend Bethlehem Lutheran and St. Joan of Arc for this ministry. And it's just been a treat for me to be with you. And the slides will be available through Diane, or if you took down my email at the front end, I'm glad to send them to you. And I just want to wish you the best for the upcoming holidays and for the rest of your life.
Well, thank you, Ted. We appreciate you being with us tonight and all your information and willing to share your slides with us. And we're also happy for all of you who have joined us tonight. I want to remind you that our tech person is going to put in a link that you can join to sign up for our Mental Health Monday email lists. So you'll know when our next events are. And because of COVID, they are going to be via Zoom webinar like this again tonight. But because of, we always take off the month of December, so our next actual programming will not be till Monday, January 11th of 2021. And our speakers that night will be Pastor Metta Herrick Carlson, Bethlehem Lutheran Church, Twin Cities, and Father Jim DeBreiker from St. Joan of Arc Catholic Community. And together they're going to speak on it's personal, clergy, faith, and mental health. So again, our next program is going to be July 11th, 2021. And again, it's a Monday. But I also wanted to let you know that you can rewatch this, rewatch these webinars on the Mental Health Connect YouTube channel. So you can go to youtube.com and in the search section, put in Mental Health Connect. And so you'll be able to rewatch these, not just this one, but the other ones that we've put on the YouTube channel as well from the previous months. So I just wanted to let you know that all is going on. And again, January 11th, 2021 is the Monday to join us. And make sure that you share these with your friends, neighbors, or loved ones. You can sign up for our email list, or you can find the link on Bethlehem Lutheran Church Twin Cities website or the St. Joan of Arc website to get the link to join for that event and ongoing events. So enjoy the holidays and be safe and have a wonderful evening, everyone. And thanks for joining us again.